Ontario is often imagined as endless lakes, safe towns, and quiet streets winding through peaceful forests. But scattered across that same landscape are places where entire communities simply vanished. Not because of war, not because of disaster, but because the systems that built them stopped. Railways moved, mines closed, forests were cut bare. When the work disappeared, the towns followed. Drive long enough through the northern roads, and you may find moss covered foundations, empty harbors, and streets that fade into trees, raising a quiet question: what happens to a town after the people leave? Balaclava. The first place feels almost accidental. Balaclava sits in Renfrew County, tucked quietly between forest roads and farmland. At first glance, it looks like little more than a clearing in the woods. But in the late 19th century, this was a lumber town built around a massive sawmill. Timber from the surrounding forests fed an industry that seemed endless. Homes appeared quickly. A school followed. Workers arrived with families and the assumption that the town would grow. It didn't. By the early 20th century, the surrounding forests had been harvested faster than anyone expected. Without timber, the mill slowed, then stopped. People didn't leave all at once. They drifted away slowly, year by year, until the remaining houses were simply absorbed by the trees. Today, the road still passes through the old town site. You can find stone foundations, scattered ruins, and faint outlines of streets that once carried workers to the mill. Not because of ghosts, but because industries built on natural resources rarely last forever. Balaclava is quiet. In the next place is quieter. Depot Harbor. The silence changes near the water. Depot Harbor was once one of the busiest ports on Georgian Bay, built by the Canadian Pacific Railway in the early 20th century. Grain arrived by train and was loaded into enormous elevators before being shipped across the Great Lakes. For a time, it worked perfectly. Trains arrived constantly. Ships lined the harbor. Entire neighborhoods grew around the port to house workers and their families. Then the routes changed. Shipping patterns shifted west. Rail operations moved elsewhere. By the mid-20th century, the harbor that once powered the town no longer had a purpose. Most residents left within a generation. The grain elevators disappeared. Buildings collapsed. The harbor slowly emptied until only fragments remained. And today the shoreline holds pieces of rusted infrastructure and quiet industrial ruins. Not because the town was cursed, but because transportation networks can erase communities almost overnight. And further north, the pattern repeats, but with heavier consequences. Grant. Grant is harder to find. The settlement formed during the early expansion of logging and rail construction in Algoma District, when northern Ontario's dense forests promised decades of work and steady industry. As rail lines pushed deeper into the region, small communities appeared almost overnight along the tracks. Grant was one of them. At its peak, the settlement held modest homes, a few supply stores, and a cemetery that quietly recorded the lives of workers and their families. The railway brought timber out of the forests, and for a time, the rhythm of trains and saws gave the town a sense of permanence. But industries built on natural resources rarely remain stable for long. As the surrounding forests were gradually harvested, logging slowed. Rail activity shifted toward more productive routes. Jobs disappeared, first slowly, then all at once. Unlike larger towns that struggled to reinvent themselves, Grant never had that chance. It simply faded. Families moved away in search of work. Buildings were left standing, and over time, the forest began reclaiming the open spaces that had once held streets and homes. Today, travelers occasionally stumble across the old cemetery and scattered stone foundations hidden beneath layers of vegetation. The town itself is nearly invisible unless you know where to look. Not because people abandoned it overnight, but because some communities disappear so gradually that history quietly forgets them. And the next place is different, because there, history is impossible to ignore. Central Patricia. Gold built this town. Central Patricia appeared during the Red Lake Gold Rush of the 1930s, when prospectors pushed deep into northern Ontario searching for deposits hidden beneath frozen ground and thick forest. What they found was enough to create an entire community almost overnight. The mine produced steady gold, and the town grew around it. Roads were carved through the wilderness. Houses appeared beside newly built streets. Small businesses opened to serve the workers who arrived with the expectation that the mine would last for generations. For decades, life followed the rhythm of the operation. And when the mine ran day and night, the town felt alive. When shifts ended, lights glowed in homes scattered across the settlement. But communities tied to a single industry often stand on fragile ground. By the 1960s, the richest deposits had begun to decline. Operating the mine became harder to justify. Eventually, the decision was made to close it. The change was immediate. Workers relocated to other mining regions. Families moved south in search of stability. Shops closed. Houses emptied. The buildings remained, but the purpose of the town had quietly vanished. Today, visitors exploring the Red Lake region can still find remnants of mining structures and quiet streets surrounded by forest. Not because of supernatural stories, but because places built around a single resource rarely survive once that resource disappears. And the next location carries an even heavier story: Silver Islet. On the rugged north shore of Lake Superior, the village of Silver Islet grew around what was once believed to be one of the richest silver deposits in the world. In the late 19th century, miners carved tunnels beneath a narrow rocky outcrop extending into the lake. The ore discovered there was astonishingly pure, drawing workers and investors from across Canada and beyond. A small but busy community formed along the shoreline. Houses stood close together against the wind, while docks and supply buildings crowded the water's edge. Life here was never easy. Lake Superior is known for its sudden storms, icy winters, and relentless waves. Workers lived with the constant sound of water striking the rocks just beyond their homes. Mining beneath the lake created enormous technical challenges. Pumps ran constantly to keep the tunnels dry. Engineers fought a daily battle against water pressing in from every direction. For a time, the effort succeeded, but flooding remained a constant threat. Eventually, the water won. When the mine closed in the 1880s, the town lost the industry that sustained it. Many residents moved away in search of work elsewhere. The once active settlement slowly shrank. Parts of the village still survive today, but the remains of the mining operation tell a quieter story. Not because the town failed, but because extracting wealth from the earth often meets limits that technology cannot overcome. And compared to the next place, this story almost feels gentle, because the next community didn't just lose work. It lost nearly everything at once. Using Cobalt's abandoned mining district. The town of Cobalt still exists today, but scattered across the surrounding hills are the remains of dozens of smaller settlements that appeared during one of the largest silver rushes in North American history. In the early 1900s, miners arrived almost overnight. Prospectors poured into the region after rich silver veins were discovered beneath the rocky ground. Within months, wooden headframes began rising across the hillsides. Rail lines stretched outward through the forest to move ore south toward refineries and markets. What had once been a quiet stretch of northern Ontario suddenly became one of the most productive mining districts on the continent. At its peak, the region held hundreds of mining claims. Small communities formed around the shafts, clusters of homes, boarding houses, supply stores, and rail sidings that served the growing workforce. For a while, it seemed unstoppable, but silver deposits rarely last forever. As the richest veins were exhausted, production slowed. Mines that once ran day and night began shutting down one after another. Workers moved on to newer discoveries. The small communities built around those shafts gradually emptied. Buildings were abandoned. Equipment remained where it had been left. Today, the hills surrounding Cobalt are scattered with rusting machinery, collapsing structures, and silent mine sites slowly being reclaimed by vegetation. Not because of tragedy, but because boomtowns built on sudden wealth often fade just as quickly. And yet, even among these abandoned mines, some places feel different, quieter, older, and harder to explain. Sikistam, the hidden rail settlements of Blizzard Valley. The final place isn't a single town, it is a landscape. In Blizzard Valley near Sudbury, the story begins with the arrival of the railway. During the early expansion of Northern Ontario's rail system, tracks pushed steadily through forests and rocky hills, opening remote land to settlement. Small communities began appearing along these lines, built to serve railway workers, farmers, and the industries that followed the trains north. Houses rose beside the tracks. Barns stood in open fields carved from forest. Modest general stores and supply depots served the families who believed the railway would anchor their future there. For a time, it did. The trains carried timber, ore, and agricultural goods through the valley, linking these scattered settlements to larger towns and markets. And the railway gave the region purpose. It gave the communities rhythm. But transportation systems rarely stay the same. As decades passed, rail technology improved. Freight routes shifted toward larger hubs. Some lines carried less traffic, and others were quietly removed altogether. The economic gravity that once pulled people into the valley began drifting elsewhere. The changes were gradual. One family moved away when work became uncertain. Another left when the farm no longer supported them. A store closed. A house stood empty. Then another. Over time, the communities scattered through Blizzard Valley slowly thinned until only fragments remained. Today, the countryside holds quiet reminders of that earlier life. Abandoned homes leaning slightly with age, collapsing barns surrounded by tall grass, and faint traces of settlements that once depended on the railway. There is no single moment when these towns disappeared, just years of slow departure, not because of ghosts, but because sometimes the systems that create communities simply move on, leaving the structures behind. And when the forest grows back around them, the silence begins to feel almost permanent. Across Ontario's forests and shorelines, these places remain almost unnoticed. No dramatic ruins, no legends carved into the landscape, just foundations, empty harbors, and roads that lead to towns that no longer exist. They remind us of something easy to forget. Communities feel permanent when we live in them. History suggests otherwise. Sometimes a town disappears quietly enough that only the forest remembers where it once stood.